Wellesley Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
We're so very fortunate to have Rabbi Kaufman, who is a retired rabbi from Temple Bethel in Fall River. He's a philosopher and author of several books and articles. He was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary and went on to receive a doctorate in philosophy from Boston University in 1971 and an honorary degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1990. He's also worked as an adjunct professor of philosophy at Rhode Island College. He's presently teaching the history of God at 11:30, which I've been taking. And the Monday after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, he asked us to have a moment of silence and opened a dialogue with the class. As we shared our views on the hatred and prejudice, I realized this was an American issue that this class should address. Our speaker, Senator Eldridge, who had planned to be here this morning, had a community event for the homeless and felt he needed to be there. He will speak to us in the spring. And Rabbi Kaufman stepped up to the plate and agreed to have an open forum with us on the nature of hatred speech. His skills in helping us have a dialogue comes from him being such a good listener and giving us time to think and respond. He wants us to read the article, and I think people were pretty good about doing that we handed out to give us a perspective on how to think about the problem. Please join us in the dialogue this morning. I was going to make a remark about Red Sox pitching and how you could step up to the plate and win the game. But
I'm a pinch hitter today. Okay. We are all disturbed over the fact that there is a climate of hate and unrest in America. Why is this so? One reason is that words matter. We find that out every day, that words matter. This point is expounded by Dr. Richard A. Friedman, a professor of clinical psychiatry at Cornell Medical College, in an article he wrote for the New York Times November 1st. The title of the op-ed piece is "The Neuroscience of Hate Speech." What does he mean by that? Let's explore it. Dr. Friedman begins his essay by asking a question. Do the words of politicians, the president especially, matter? He goes on to say this: since he has been in office, President Trump has relentlessly demonized his political opponents as evil and belittled them as stupid. Every other person he speaks to, he belittles and demonizes, actually. He has called undocumented immigrants animals. His rhetoric has been a powerful contributor to our climate of hate, which is amplified by the right-wing media and virulent live culture. Of course, it is difficult to prove that incendiary speech is a direct cause of violent acts, but humans are social creatures, especially the unhinged and misfits among us, who are easily influenced by the rage that is everywhere these days. I used to belong to a group called Marriage Encounter. And how many of you were in Marriage Encounter? Anybody? Yeah. Are you still in it? No. I don't know whatever happened to it, but it was very good at the time. And there was a saying in Marriage Encounter, love is all around us. I think we could say today, hate is all around us. Just in the past few weeks, we have seen the horrifying slaughter of 11 Jewish people in a synagogue in Pittsburgh with the man arrested described as a rabid anti-Semite, and we've also seen the attempted bombing of prominent Trump critics, the attempted bombing of prominent Trump critics by an ardent Trump supporter. Psychology and neuroscience can give us some important insights into the power of powerful people's words. Neuroscience tells us that repeated exposure to hate speech can increase prejudice. It can also desensitize individuals to verbal aggression because it normalizes what is usually socially condemned behavior. Hate speech can provoke a surge of stress hormones and engage the amygdala, the brain center for threat. Robert Bowers, the killer in Pittsburgh, apparently blamed Jews for helping transport members of the Central American migrant caravan. He did not think the president was going far enough in protecting the country from invaders. He said, "I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered." But you don't have to be this unhinged to be moved to violence by incendiary rhetoric. Just about any of us could be susceptible. Distrust of an out group is linked to anger and impulses to violence. Trump fosters this distrust of out groups by dehumanizing them. "These aren't people," he once said about undocumented immigrants suspected of gang ties. "These are animals." Both science and history suggest that people will act on their prejudices in the worst ways when these people are put under stress, pressured by peers, or receive approval by authority figures to die for. So when someone like President Trump dehumanizes a group of people, he could be putting them beyond the reach of empathy, beyond the reach of social cognition, the ability to put oneself in someone else's place, stripping them of moral protection and making it easier to harm them. Friedman concludes his essay by considering the classic experiments by Stanley Milgram. Are you familiar with that? The Yale psychologist, showing the willingness of a group of men to obey authority figures. Subjects were told to administer electric shocks to another participant without knowing that the shocks were fake. 65% of the subjects did what they were told and delivered the maximum shock, which, if real, could have been fatal. The implication is that we can easily be influenced by authority figures to do terrible harm to others just by receiving an order. Thus, there is no doubt about the power of political speech to foment physical violence. This is the neuroscience of hate speech. Now, how many of you read this article, The Neuroscience of Hate Speech? How many of you agree with it? Does anybody have any comment to make on it? Anybody want to comment on the article? Do you agree that neuroscience shows us how hate speech can lead to violent actions? So nobody has any doubts about that. What can we do about it? That's the question. Does anybody have any view on that? Yes.
It seems to me that when we witness or hear hate speech, one or two people who are hearing it need to react negatively, if that's the way you feel, and otherwise the perpetrator is just going to go free. I mean, he's entitled to an opinion, but we're also entitled to our opinions.
Anybody else have something to say? Don't all rush at once. Feel free to talk. You're on television. Yes.
I think he means you don't want us to be the silent majority. I just wanted to comment, and when you were reading, it reminded me of the situation where our kids and grandkids are seeing a lot of violence on TV. There's so much violence on TV. I know a lot of people our age don't even want to watch it, but it's beginning to seem normal, and that's really scary. The same as this.
I agree with you. I agree with you 100% that all of the violence on TV and in the movies can make it seem normal and natural, and that leads to a lot of violence. Definitely the media have a lot to do with it, yes. Does anybody else have something to say about that? Yes.
I think when the President of the United States, espouses all this hate talk, is much more. I think when the President of the United States espouses all this hate talk, it is much more influential and damaging to people, and he makes it the norm, much more so than the programs on television.
Yeah, I think they're equally to blame. So what can we do about him? Does anybody think that he should be impeached, or a lot of people think he should be impeached? But meanwhile, he's there and he's doing damage every day. It's incredible, isn't it? Yes, do you want to say something, sir?
Well, I just
Yes.
wanted to mention, this is an intergenerational effect, it seems to me. I mean, I remember when I was a little boy watching the Army McCarthy hearings on television when I was homesick, and it was astounding to me then, and just sort of imprinted the idea of the snarling hatred of people toward each other. This, I think, set a particular sense in me that the world could be dangerous with people who couldn't see the humanity of other people. And I think probably our kids are more affected by real people who they can see on television or live with, sort of venting such horrible things about other people.
I think the key word is dehumanizing. That Trump has the capacity to dehumanize someone right on the spot, and when you dehumanize people, you make people who are prone to violence susceptible to terrible things, to terrible actions. It's sort of gives people an incentive when the president says it seems to say it's all right. Yes, sir.
I agree with you about President Trump. However, I tend to think that these kinds of issues have been going on, obviously, for a long time historically. But some of the symptoms that I have seen are even some of the sitcoms, the sitcoms that are on television that talk, and have been doing so for some time, disrespectfully about other people within the sitcom, which I think is a systemic part of this issue. And I also would like to consider technology is another issue that I think has driven people apart by having great communication, yes, it's a great tool, yes, but when you find particularly younger people who are sitting across the table from one another and they are communicating with one another by their cell phone or texting or what have you, to me that inhibits discussion, and people then become disagreeable and can disagree, but they then become disagreeable as well.
Yes. Do you want to say something? Yes. What is your name? What is your name? Deborah. Yes.
Oh. Now stand up.
I agree. I think there is a lot of violence on television, but I think when a president reinforces that His word is much more meaningful, and I think also that there is an element of people who are on the borderline who would be more incited to create violence because of it. I think his verbal abuse creates physical violence.
Well said. Verbal abuse creates physical violence. Definitely. Yes, sir.
I want to disagree a little bit about the notion that violence is in media, in TV, films, things like that, is the harm that many people believe it is. Because you start with such literary classics as the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they are really very violent. Shakespeare's Hamlet, there's a lot of killing goes on there. Now, I find so many of these films aimed at younger people violent to the point that I can't possibly enjoy them. But I don't see the violence as itself necessarily motivating the viewer to a violent act. And that violence plays an important part in our whole literary experience in terms of telling us about the world that we live in and how bad things can get. And a big point that I like to think to be understood is that people say, well, the U.S. has so much gun violence because we got violence in films and TV and things like that. And yet in Japan, I understand they love it. The video games full of violence that the young Japanese love, and yet they don't go on shooting rampages. And the only explanation is that you can't get your hands on battlefield weapons in Japan the way you can in this country. And it's simply a matter of the availability of weapons in this country and not the fact that this country is more violently inclined.
Yes, question.
I'd just like to make a comment, because I think many of us, probably everybody in this room, feel somewhat helpless in face of what's been happening over and over again with these shootings. In fact, with the last one in Thousand Oaks, one of the reporters said every emotion was expressed by the people he interviewed except surprise, which is really shocking when you think about it, that we're no longer surprised when these things happen. And one thing that I was wondering, it keeps coming to me, that there have been examples where people have really made a difference. And I hope someone will correct me if I've got the facts wrong, which I may have done. I should have looked this up beforehand. But I think at the beginning of World War II, when Germany occupied Denmark, I'm pretty certain it was the experience of the Danes. And one of the things that the Nazis did was to rule that all Jews should identify themselves by wearing a star. And the way the Danes responded was that every Dane put a star on his clothing. And you know, that kind of solidarity with a group or with a cause is enormously powerful. And I think, for me, it's also very encouraging that is something that we could do. We could really stand up and support the kind of society that we want, whether we do it by writing to Congress or demonstrating or writing letters to the press or whatever. But we could be active as we can be, rather than feeling helpless and passive.
Very good point. Yes. Yes.
Going along with that, which I think was an excellent reminder of what could be done, we have to hold accountable our elected officials, particularly the ones in Congress, that do not say anything, that do not challenge the president when he says these awful things and demonizes people and doesn't allow free press, if he could help it. Those people that we elected are not doing what they should be doing, in my estimation, to stop this. Yes, you could say they'd be out of office, this and that, repercussions, but it's the brave ones that will make the change, just like all those people in Denmark. So we have to ask ourselves, why don't they? Why don't we hold our elected officials accountable for it? Why don't they they don't say a word when this goes on? That's just my...
Yes, another comment, yes. No, I agree with what she said, yeah.
On the idea of violence has always been with us, for instance, back in Shakespeare and the Iliad and the Odyssey and whatever. Even nursery rhymes, those used to have violence. I think the huge difference is people did not personally connect with what was on the printed page. Children didn't connect with the ogre in the forest or the witch, whatever. Today's violence is humans that look and are just like us, and it's very visual on a screen, on a big movie screen, or on television. That's much more, I think, impactful than reading the Iliad or reading the Three Bears.
Yes, sir.
Would you? Oh, okay.
Took so long for the microphone to get here, I forgot what I was going to ask. So if you talk about violence, if you go back to the Bible and do a good read, you'll see violence. And I like to comment that, unfortunately, my philosophy is that nothing's changed except for technology. But I think the thing that troubles me the most is the fact that this kind of hate speech is acceptable to some segment of our population who have license now, because when they hear it from the president, act on it in various ways. And the troubling part is that there's so many people in our society who agree with what he says and agree with how he behaves. And that's the thing that really
that is
me.
the problem, is that he has a lot of people behind him. That is the problem, yes. I agree with that. Did you want to say something, Miss? Yeah.
There are a couple of things. One thing is that the people that our president has been appealing to, and it's those people who feel that they are have-nots, and they're feeling discouraged, and they want someone to blame. And this is what's happened. It happened in Germany. It happened at these times of unrest and lack of hope to be able to move out of where you're going. And it is very easy at that point to blame. And then when you have someone who says, not only is it okay to blame, but you can act on this, and oh, by the way, we should put the means in everybody's hands to act on it, because after all, if we have, we should certainly arm our teachers, and we should have, SWAT teams outside of religious buildings. So it's a bigger issue. It's dealing again with the psychology. And then there are some groups that are traditionally and by default the people that are blamed. and they scoop up others because it's easy to blame somebody else. It's not something I can do, and I think this is quite true of the people that we have voted in. They're more interested in their perks and their re-election. It's been a long time since they've done things to really, that they're governing to make it a better country. They're just trying to get re-elected.
Any other comments? Well, wherever you go, you pick up an article about hate. Here's an article which was in the Boston Sunday Globe, November the 18th. That was yesterday. Hate descends on Massachusetts schools. In recent weeks, someone left a death threat for a 10-year-old Muslim girl at a Framingham elementary school. At Melrose Veterans Memorial Middle School, swastikas were discovered inside bathrooms. Racist graffiti was spray painted on the doors of a predominantly African-American school in South Boston. This is Massachusetts. This is America. What's ailing our state is a snapshot of our festering nation. More than divided, we're fractured and broken, and pouring from every fissure is hatred based on race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And it has taken root in American schools. For the third consecutive year, hate crimes rose nationwide last year, up 17% from 2016, according to the FBI. In Massachusetts in 2017, there were 427 incidents, from vandalism to assault. That was a 9% increase. Too many of these heinous acts are happening in this state's schools, colleges, and universities. We're on the same dismal path for 2018. On Thursday, anti-LGBTQ and anti-Semitic graffiti was scrawled in a residence hall at UMass Amherst. The week before, white supremacist propaganda was discovered on campus. At Massachusetts Regional High School in Boxford, Nazi symbols were found in boys' bathrooms. Reading Memorial High School, Reading Memorial High School has been hit with at least 8 incidents of racist or anti-Semitic graffiti in recent weeks. Since May 2017, there have been more than 30 reported incidents at town schools. So hate is in the schools as well. What can we do about that? Any comment? It all has to do with this can anybody here understand the psychology of a white supremacist? Can you understand what makes them tick? Why would someone get this idea that white people are better than anybody else and that everybody else is to be put down? Where would someone get an idea like that? From their parents. And where did the parents get it from? Their parents. You have to be taught to hate. That's a good line. From South Pacific, did you hear that? There's a line, you have to be taught to hate. So it's all a matter of education. Yes?
And when the facts are wrong, the media has to be encouraged to publicize the true facts. For instance, this group of immigrants who are murderers and rapists and all that, who are coming up from middle South America. We know, those of us who pay attention to what's going on, that there's a very, very small percentage of immigrant people who cause trouble. And granted, the newspapers do say that sometimes, but much less than about if there were a person who was committing crime and who was an immigrant and coming up. The newspapers would spend a lot more time reporting that than disputing it and telling the facts, the statistics of who's who and who these immigrant people are and what motivates them. So I think that we need to keep the media feet to the fire as well.
I wanted to address your remark about education. And as a former classroom teacher, I think that what is so important if we're going to educate our children is that we address critical thinking. And since I was a history teacher and planned curriculum, one of the things that we did was to work with the children so that they didn't take what was taught in class as the absolute word. We tried to get primary sources so that children could read both sides of things. Thanksgiving is a wonderful opportunity to teach what else was going on besides the Pilgrims. Columbus, we read his diaries and found out he wasn't such a great guy after all. So that when we taught the newspaper, we had them read different newspapers that took in different views. And it was so interesting because some of the children who traveled abroad would bring back newspapers. I mean, they really got into it. When we taught the Civil War, we got them to go back and look at the opinion pages of different states. Now, for my husband and I, we've decided that we should listen to different TV programs so that we get different views of things. And I think that this is a way to develop critical thinkers.
Very good point. I've always insisted on critical thinking. That's one thing you learn when you major in philosophy, that it's critical thinking is very important. What does critical thinking mean? It means that when you analyze a statement or a sentence or something somebody says, there's two questions you ask. What do you mean and how do you know? So you should ask the white supremacist, how do you know that whites are superior? And what do you mean by it? What do you mean and how do you know? That's critical thinking. So that's a good antidote to hate. That if we use critical thinking, we can get beyond hate. Do you agree with what I just said? Yeah. Does anybody else have something to say? Yes.
I'd just like to follow up on the education, our quest to help our children understand different points of view. I taught a fantastic course for, I don't know, at least 10 years called Facing History and Ourselves. And I was teaching 8th graders, and it's very sobering for them to use the Holocaust as a case study to reveal what happened in history and to see it in their own lives, in the locker rooms and so on, with discrimination and intolerance and all of these kinds of things. They learn what these words mean, and they also read primary sources to try to get down to the basics of what people meant. And I just it was really a eye-opening kind of course for me to see how they responded. We also saw the Milgram experiment. We saw some videos like that for them to see that people will just follow orders If they see someone in a doctor's coat, that looks official, they'll just do what they said, Anyway, that's just a middle school point of view.
Okay, I wanted to follow up on Facing History. Facing History is an incredible course, and we're going to have a speaker in the spring, Janet Applefield, who works with Facing History, and she will give us her own account as being a Holocaust survivor. And what she's going to stress in her talk is the role of the bystander. And that was so important in Facing History, is that you can't stand by and let things happen. And I think that's a very strong message for all of us today.
How many of you think that what's happening in America today with all this hate is similar in any way to what happened in Nazi Germany? You all agree? You think so? Could I have somebody comment on that? Would you like to comment?
Well, I run an international trading company, very small, but
Mm-hmm.
around the world and across the states. And recently in Ohio, there was a gathering of working class men, and I walked into a small group of 6 or 8 that were discussing the fact that one of the radio stations was now playing Hitler's speeches, and they thought this was hysterically funny. I said, my parents, my father and his brothers fought in World War II, as did my mother's brothers, and I didn't find it funny at all. And there was really no comment. It was just a look like, don't you understand? It's the whites that are in power here. It was just pretty scary. I think we live in a bubble here in New England that is unique, that there's a liberal bent and that people discuss things rationally. And the hatred doesn't have any discussion. That hatred is hatred.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that, on the question I asked about comparisons with Hitler's Germany? Yes.
So after the Pittsburgh event, we had a big service at our temple, and one of the things that our rabbi said that struck me was that in Germany, the police actually participated in events, and in this country, the police came in and helped save the people that were there.
That's a good. That's
in Germany, the politicians fomented it, and when this happened in this country, the politicians came to the Jewish people to show their support. So there is a difference.
There is a difference. That's
there is
good.
a big difference.
I'm glad you mentioned that. There is a difference, yes. Anybody else have a question or comment? Yes, sir. You're getting a lot of exercise.
If we were football, we could toss it.
I find fault with the term hate speech or hate thought as a tool for understanding the issue. Because it seems to me that what we're talking about is a continuum, like a spectrum. At one end, you have somebody who bitterly and deeply hates someone who belongs to a certain group, certain class. At the other end of that spectrum, you have people that are indifferent to the well-being of those people. A little further along, you have people who are mildly dislike the group and so forth. So it's not hate or not hate. And so a more critical way of thinking that way, I think, will shed a little better light on what can happen. At the end of the spectrum where people are not hate-driven, but simply indifferent, that makes it possible for those who are hate-driven to carry out acts. I lived a little while in the 1940s in below the Mason-Dixon line, and the antagonism toward Negroes could be seen that way. You had people that didn't care too much about how the Negro fared versus those who bitterly disliked them. You know, not quite Ku Klux Klan types. But so unless we see things on this spectrum, I think we've got a pretty clumsy tool. And I think that the citing the Rodgers and Hammerstein song, "You've got to be taught to hate," I think that is fundamentally incorrect. You don't have to be taught to hate. My own experience was coming from a small town to New York City, a certain group of people I had heard were considered undesirable. I had no experience with them, but when I encountered aspects of the slovenly life and troublesome ways, I thought, boy, those people really are no good. The point we've got to, I think, teach ourselves and our society is, look, if a group as a whole exhibits behavior that we don't like, we still have to be fair to them in the sense that there are individuals within that group that are perfectly good. And you see this in things like these crime shows. I run up against this with my own observations. Again and again, the police catch somebody, and I find myself saying, oh yeah, they caught the culprit. It's another black guy. But you've got to remind yourself that even if more people in a group commit a crime, you still got to be open-minded toward the group as a whole, because a lot of its individuals can be perfectly excellent citizens.
Thank you. So you're saying that hate is like an instinct. That's the same thing that there was a whole series of articles about hate in the November 12th issue of Time magazine. And one of the authors who wrote for this magazine said, "Hate, among all our base instincts, is the most distinctly human. In animals, violence and venom are tools of survival. In humans, of supremacy. Small, scared people hate. Self-hating people hate. Bullied and betrayed people hate, as though hate will make them large and safe and strong." So the question is hate an instinct, or does it have to be taught? How many of you think that hate has to be taught? How many of you think hate is an instinct? The rest of you are non-committal. Yes?
People who are dropouts from society and can't make it, whatever that means, and they resent people some of whom have started out with less than they and have been able
Very good point. I agree.
And so this is the kind of thinking that other people who are in that same boat gravitate towards.
I couldn't agree more. I think the basic problem in our society is the inequality, and that the have-nots envy the haves. And that is the cause of a lot of violence and a lot of hatred. And I think it's the worst thing about our society is the inequalities. Anybody agree with me on that? Good. You all will get A's in the course. Now, I think the inequality, the have-nots versus the haves, that's the underlying motive here. Yes. Do you have a comment? Yes.
Well, it occurs to me, too, that some of the people that we, in quotes, look down on, or we say, oh, yeah, well, I look at those conditions, or they aren't smart. These are people who have not been given the opportunity to learn. They're perfectly capable of it if they are given the opportunity. And so we create these, in some measures, we create these situations and then have negative feeling about them. And I think one of the places that we as a society, when hopefully we never get to the point where we all have to put on yellow stars, but we can begin to educate people very early on. And you know, there is absolutely no reason to say a person of color isn't as smart as someone who is white. But that's where I think we can begin to work.
Thank you. One of the things that makes for prejudice, I remember reading a book called The Nature of Prejudice by a psychologist named Gordon Allport. One of the things that makes for prejudice is false generalizations or overgeneralizations, like all blacks are stupid or something like that. Those are the kinds of statements that make for prejudice and hatred, overgeneralizations.
I wanted to address Gordon Allport's writing because this is included in Facing History, which I also have the opportunity to teach. And one of the issues that we got the kids to address was predilection and prejudice. And predilection comes before people develop prejudice. It's what they've been conditioned to, where they've lived, what kind of conversations they've been around. And this is important to get kids to think about. And one of the activities I did was to get a lot of lemons and put them in the middle of the table. And they all looked at the lemons. And then I said, okay, you take your lemon and look at the lemon and then put it back in the middle of the table. And I said, okay, well, what have we got here? And they said lemons. So we're generalizing that they're lemons. And then I said, all right, you take your lemon. And it was so interesting because the kids had studied the lemon long enough to see, you know, there was a speck on one or whatever. And when they took their lemons back, I said, why do you think that you were able to pick out your own lemon? And this was just such an opening to talk about generalizations. And once you get to know someone or open your mind to it, your opinion will be different.
You agree with that? Yeah. Any more questions? Here's some more food for thought. Anti-Semitic incidents have increased dramatically, up 57% in just the past year, according to the Anti-Defamation League. In fact, hate crimes are up across the board. Statistics show that the number of people killed by far-right extremists in September 11th is roughly equal to the number killed in the United States by jihadist terrorists, a fact that has received little public attention and gone unremarked upon by FBI Director Christopher Wray. Two major developments appear to be driving the rise in acts of hatred. The first is the creation of an extremist community online. Both Robert Bowers, the suspected Pittsburgh shooter, and Caesar Sayoc Jr., who is believed to be responsible for mailing 14 pipe bombs to high-profile Donald Trump critics, and CNN were compulsive netizens. Sayoc maintained multiple accounts on Facebook and Twitter. Bowers frequented Gab, a social network used by white supremacists driven off Twitter. The second development that has lit up this increasingly linked and animated extremist world is Trump. The statistics demonstrate clearly that the biggest bump in hate crimes in recent history coincides with the period since his presidential campaign began. This is not just a matter of correlation. Trump's incendiary rhetoric has given license to those who peddle hatred to emerge from the shadows. So again, we come back to Trump. Can't get away from him. Yes.
To bring the focus a little bit closer, I was interested in just a few weeks ago, there was an article in the Times suggesting that parents stop spanking their children.
Oh.
Now, the idea that somehow corporal punishment is still a part of daily life in a significant number of people, that it takes a study by the American Pediatric Association to make it clear that when you disempower children and treat them like they don't belong with you, they don't belong here, it has an effect that sort of translates over time. So I think the issue about our president, I think people talk about he doesn't have a feeling for people. And that doesn't come inherently, always. That comes from the way in which one is treated and sort of felt by the family. So somehow I think there's an issue in the family that is particularly difficult to address. I mean, I remember when I was a kid again, the families in the neighborhood that were absolutely horrible to their children were saved by an elementary school teacher who really saw the child as someone of value. And I don't know that we're really looking so much, we're looking sort of out rather than looking inward about the way in which we treat and value our children.
Good point.
We have time for about one more comment.
One more comment. Who wants to make the last comment? Yes.
I think these are difficult times, and I attribute some of it to the politicians and to cable TV and some talk radio. But I'd also like to point out that over time, at least in this neck of the woods, a lot of problems tend to disappear along these lines. You think about how the Irish were really terrible. Nobody in Boston would be too concerned about the Irish these days. There was a time when Jews were not accepted in the area, and nobody worries much about that in this neck of the woods, or blacks, or even Hispanics. So some things over time are changing, at least in a small area, and I don't know what our long-run prospects are, but if we can get past the current tensions, maybe there's hope ahead.
That's a good optimistic note on which to end. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts today. And I think we all have something to leave with. So thank you very much.
Thank you.